Hi, this is David Hildebrand, and this is going to be a lecture on John Dewey's The Lost Individual from a collection of essays entitled Individualism, Old and New from 1930. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about, give a little bit of background to the piece, give an introduction to it, and then we'll talk about the state of individuals, the interdependence of self and society, the contributors to the disintegration of individualism, as Dewey sees it, signs that this is happening, signs of the disintegration, the false or ineffectual solutions that are tried from religion, self-help, and moralizing, and we'll talk a bit about Dewey's idea as to how we could rethink or reconstruct individualism. So the focal question in this piece is, in what ways are individuals isolated and disintegrating in our age? And Dewey is writing from the perspective of someone in the 1930s, late 20s. What are some of the causes? What are some of the proposed solutions? So a little bit of background. This piece was published on April 24th, 1929, just about 6 months before the American stock market crashed. Now, this was a period in which Americans were enduring declines in production, rises in unemployment, and a period in which stocks were greatly overvalued. Wages were low, there was a proliferation of debt, an agricultural sector that was struggling, and there were an excess of large bank loans that couldn't be liquidated. So, to introduce this piece, then, Dewey is seeking in this essay, in the book of essays in which this essay is collected, is an answer to the question, how could a new form of individualism be created that's appropriate to a society as it really is? Dewey looks around and he finds numerous contradictions in American culture, especially, as he puts it, between our institutions and practice on the one hand and our creeds and theories on the other. During Dewey's time, it was very popular to idealize a rugged individualism. But, Dewey asked, how does this square with our views in other areas, our moral views, our religious views, for example? How does it square with our interdependent industrial and scientific institutions, our lives, that is? It doesn't. Indeed, it leaves us as unprepared for industrialized life as it could. Now, we may claim to believe in such ideals, right, as individualism or rugged individualism or equality of opportunity or freedom for all, but these ideals, he thought, were twisted by what he calls the prevailing pecuniary culture. And this is a culture which justifies instead massive inequality, massive oppression, right? It rationalizes these things, especially in the economic sphere, on the basis of economic struggle, which is dressed up as some kind of survival of the fittest. Now, while Dewey was aware of the rising forces of science and technology in society, especially as they manifested in forms such as quantification, mechanization, and standardization, and he is aware that these forces also posed threats to individuality, Dewey nevertheless argued that technology could be deployed much more constructively. It could be deployed in ways that could emancipate individuality. So in the analysis offered in this piece and in other similar essays around this time, the major threat to individualism comes from the dominant ends to which technology has been put, especially towards private profit. So if one combines these 2 points, right, on the one hand, rugged individualism, the stress on it, and on the other hand, the misuses of technology, one can start to see the outlines of Dewey's objective: to tackle the deep problem, as he puts it, of, quote, constructing a new individuality that's consonant with the objective conditions under which we live. So if we could admit that the pioneer age of rugged individualism is past, and that our complex, increasingly urban and industrial present signals a need to think through our collective and collaborative arrangements, then at least part of our efforts have to be directed, he thought, towards critique of large-scale business corporations and trusts, because these, after all, are the actual forces dominating economic and daily life. So what comes, Dewey asks, from the increased concentration of corporate economic power? Well, at the very least, it creates a system of mass education, a system of pervasive and insistent advertising, and an economic life that is increasingly premised on consumerism. Well, what do these phenomena contribute to the repression of the individual? Well, these are focal questions for Dewey. So as we'll see, new forms of individualism can be achieved only with a controlled use of all of our societal resources. Dewey doesn't specify the exact form that a new individualism is going to take, but he refuses to take a retrograde position which would go back to some earlier state of society. Unlike Luddites, who would reject machine technology and science, Dewey argues that individualism has to find a way to position individuals in a corporate and technologized world, but while simultaneously realizing that transforming those institutions to human needs and human ends is also necessary. So those institutions have to be reformed, Dewey thought, because the prevailing economic system has large-scale effects. It has a maldistribution of income. It has a disproportionate tax structure. It has an ineffectual labor movement. At the time, this was quite true, and it's true again today. And it has unregulated industry. And so Dewey thought this lack of social security, the unemployment or the underemployment situation had to be dealt with some kind of social insurance, some kinds of new mechanisms, because otherwise it was just morally intolerable. Now, one necessary outcome that Dewey argued was that science and industry and business all have to accept that there is a natural role within their practices of social and ethical responsibilities. This divorce of business and science from morality or ethics has to be overcome. So as it turned out, Dewey was to a large degree prescient. Right? Many of these problems that he was describing were dealt with later on by things like the New Deal, the Fair Deal, the Great Society programs, and the labor movement. These evolved in the decades that followed. But regardless of which specific historical solutions emerged, Dewey's enduring philosophical point was this, that in an industrial and technological society, the political basis of the country, participatory democracy, must extend symmetrically into the cooperative control of industry. Because if this happens, Dewey argues, then industry can become an educative and cultural force for everyone involved in it. Industry would focus on social goods and ends and not merely profit and private power. And economic enterprise would be directed from the standpoint of the citizen and the consumer of goods and services, and not just from the standpoint of wealthy CEOs, financiers, and people who benefit from the stock market. So one last note for this introduction. Not everything comes down to social and economic planning, Dewey thought. Dewey thought that the reconstruction of individuality is also up to individuals. As he puts it, the first move to recover individuality lies, he said, with the individual himself. We must, quote, "We must cultivate our own garden, but that garden has no sharp fence about it. Our garden is the world, including the corporate and industrial world in which we live." Now, much has changed in the century or so since Dewey wrote the essays in Individualism, Old and New, and in some ways it's a product of the period in which he wrote. Still, much of it resonates with us today. The submerging of the individual that concerned Dewey is as serious a problem in our present post-industrial age as it was in the 1930s. Dewey's work helps us identify the core problem, and many of the systemic tensions fueling the problem still exist for us today. So while the solutions that we devise have to reflect our present realities, the insight we can draw from Dewey is illuminating nonetheless. So let's talk about the essay, The Lost Individual, in some greater detail. So as William James pointed out in What Makes a Life Significant, we do take in our lives both an internal and an external view on our lives, right? We're both social and individual creatures. So one question that Dewey raises is, in what sense is the individual lost? What has been lost? And he writes, the significant thing is that the loyalties which once held individuals, which gave them support, direction, and unity of outlook on life, have well nigh disappeared. In consequence, individuals are confused and bewildered. So in Dewey's estimation, individuals have become more fearful, less secure, more easily irritated, more hurried in their pace of life, and more distracted in their way of being. Sound familiar? So Dewey's diagnosis of the primary cause of this state for human beings is that people have lost stable objects of belief which were anchored in rituals and habits in social life. Put another way, community has been deteriorating, and with it, individualism. So I want you to note here the interdependent connection. So in Dewey's sense of what it means to be an individual, there is an interdependence between, on the one hand, the individual, and on the other hand, the community. If the community deteriorates, individualism deteriorates. And because the individual exists interactively with social ties, when the individual suffers deterioration, that contributes back to the deterioration of the community. So there's a feedback loop there. So what are the contributors to individualism's disintegration and sort of the narrow redefinition of individualism along sort of economic, laissez-faire economic lines? What's causing this? What are the signs? What are the contributors? So one contributor Dewey identifies as the business mindset. Now this is a mindset where operations and goals are not truly communal, right? They're not communal for the heads of business, nor are they communal for the employees. There's a divorce, he says, between the ends of business and society at large. He writes, assured and integrated individuality is the product of definite social relationships and publicly acknowledged functions. While individuals may be captains of finance and industry, until there is some consensus of belief as to the meaning of finance and industry in civilization as a whole, they cannot be captains of their own souls. They lead, but it is under cover of impersonal and socially undirected economic forces. Their reward is found not in what they do in their social office and function, but in a deflection of social consequences to private gain. They receive the acclaim and command, the envy and admiration of the crowd, but the crowd is also composed of other private individuals who are equally lost to a sense of social bearings and uses. So Dewey's point here is that while the actions of business leaders can promote results beyond their narrow interest, right? For example, a new factory can provide income to people, or a new airport can make it easier for people to travel. These social or collective benefits are really not the main intention for the business leader. The external benefits are, in a strict sense, irrelevant to their professional objectives. Right? As Dewey puts it, to themselves and to others, their business is private and its outcome is private profit. There remains a split within each of their individual selves between what their aims are and what the wider society needs.